Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Introduction to American Government. Today, I want to take some time to discuss public opinion, political ideology, socialization, and a little bit about political knowledge. First, let's talk about public opinion. Public opinion is the aggregation of individual preferences on matters of political importance. Now, when we're talking about public opinion, yes, of course, the aggregate matters. Yes, how we measure it matters. But what's really important for this class is how we come to those individual preferences. Or to put it another way, what are the sources of those individual preferences? In order to discuss this, we need to go into some detail and break these things down into their discrete categories. At the most basic are what we might call political values. These are the things that are the most closely held, and we can consider these fundamentally as guiding principles. Your textbook talks about equality, about justice, about liberty as the kind of guiding principles or the guiding values that many Americans hold. This is very much the case. These are, if not innate, then, as I say, very deeply held views on how the world works. What is the basis for individual value and the like? How much emphasis do you place on liberty versus equality versus justice manifests in a variety of ways, not just within the political sphere. We might think about these as your core ethos or your framework for understanding what is right and wrong, what is ethical and unethical in the world. And in many ways, when we're talking about political values or values more broadly, these are things that are not going to change throughout your lifetime. These are very much core or otherwise essential to who you are as a person and how you view the world around you. But we very rarely vote on purely on the basis of values. We're not weighing the different candidates on to what degree they espouse rhetoric or otherwise live up to our ideals of liberty, of justice, of equality. Instead, we tend to vote more on what are known as attitudes. These are second order. These are derived from values. And these tend to be the result of those values when faced with a political question. So, for example, let's take the issue area of government subsidized or government healthcare, public healthcare, socialized healthcare, however you want to frame that. On the basis of your values, you will engage with this question in a differential manner. If you prioritize liberty, or if you value liberty over other core values, then you may view the idea of government run healthcare or subsidized healthcare as kind of antithetical or fundamentally oppositional to your view of liberty. You may view the ability for individuals to forge their own path or to be free from government interference as more important than any of the proposed values that come from subsidized healthcare. If, on the other hand, you hold more closely to equality, you may view government run healthcare as a means through which to achieve that equality, subordinating justice, subordinating liberty to that concern for equality. So it's not just one value over another, though. It's also differences in the way that we interpret these values. Equality, justice, liberty, all of these values can be interpreted in a variety of different ways. Indeed, let's use the example of liberty. You should say that people should be free to choose their own path, to forge their own path, to engage with healthcare as they choose. But you can also view not having healthcare, not having government healthcare, as completely oppositional to liberty. People are not free to pursue their own destinies, to pursue their own path without that, and therefore, or thereby, the lack of socialized healthcare is actually a barrier to liberty. It's not actually a case of one value over another. It's the way that we understand, the way that we interpret these different values that form the kind of basic orientation towards the world. Attitudes, therefore, are a manifestation or otherwise an interpretation of political events through the lens of these very basic values. Now, one of the most dominant ways in which we view the political world is that which is political ideology. Your textbook goes into some detail about the various political ideologies. The most prominent of these in American politics today are liberalism and conservatism. And the textbook discusses these in some detail. But these are not the only political ideologies. There's also libertarianism, social democracy. We can think about socialism, fascism, monarchism. All of these are political ideologies. Fundamentally, political ideologies are a lens through which we view what is the proper role of government, what is the proper shape of society in terms of politics here. If you are, for example, a monarchist, you are going to view monarchy as the ideal form of governance in providing stability, in serving the rights and the responsibilities of the people. This may seem alien to our American sensibilities, but there are people around the world. You can think about in the United Kingdom, for example, that deeply hold with this view of monarchism, perhaps restrained by a constitution, resulting in constitutional monarchism. But there are people who view the world or the ideal way in which politics should be structured as best served through monarchy. Liberalism and conservatism, though, are tend to be the prominent views in American politics today. Progressivism, libertarianism, those are kind of the second order ones, and they exert a significant influence through politics. And we can think about these as fundamentally lenses through which to view the political world. If you are a conservative, for example, you are inherently skeptical of government action. You believe that the free market is a better way in which to resolve economic matters, and that government intervention should very much be a last resort. Liberals, to some degree, and progressives, to a much greater degree, view government intervention into the economy, just writ large, as much more desirable, as kind of hemming back some of the excesses of the free market in a way that conservatives do not. Now, whether or not you agree with one ideology over another, what your particular ideological view is ultimately irrelevant to this class. Fundamentally, understand that ideologies work as a simplifying device, fundamentally as a heuristic. When you, as someone who holds ideology, faces a political question, the lens through which you view that political question is this ideological framework. More or less government involvement, more or less control over society or the economy, whatever it might be. When faced with the question of drug legalization, for example, the superordinate priorities of liberty, of justice, of equality certainly come into play. But individuals don't have the time to go over every single political question in detail. Instead, we use and adopt these simplifying mechanisms. These are called heuristics. We use heuristics in a wide variety of domains in our everyday lives, but politically speaking, ideology is one of the main heuristics or simplifying mechanisms for which we can, or through which we can view the enormously complicated political world. Another one of these is partisanship, and partisanship is perhaps the greatest or most significant or most widespread heuristic in American politics. We can look at the world through this partisan lens. Is this policy priority? Is this issue being emphasized by the Republicans or the Democrats? And we can, on that basis, make some, shall we say, simplifying assumptions about that political question through that lens of partisanship. The textbook goes into this in a lot greater detail here, but I wanted to emphasize the point that these attitudes are the result of values, and that ideology and partisanship operate as a simplifying mechanism through which to view the enormously complicated political world. Now, let's move on to where do these values, where do these attitudes, where do these ideologies or partisan attachments actually come from? Fundamentally, this is through a process we call political socialization. Basically, this is the way in which we learn who we are politically, or otherwise, we learn our political identity. And in order to understand socialization, we need to understand the agents of socialization, or those who are responsible for our instruction, for our education into political matters, and who are therefore thereby instrumental in us developing our political identities. As you might imagine, the most significant of these tend to be parents. If you talk about politics around the dinner table growing up, you're very likely to adopt many of the values, many of the views, the attitudes, even the partisan identity or ideological identity or affinity of your parents. This may not be the case if you have a negative view of your parents. You might take the oppositional view of your parents. It depends on the circumstances there. But parents are not the only agents of socialization. Friend groups or peer groups are another really influential way in which we develop our political identity. Moreover, if you hold a conflicting political identity to your peer group, it may be the case that over time, will move towards your peer group's views. There are a variety of reasons for this, but one of these is that we value our friends. We like our friends. We don't want to make waves, and moreover, we may view our friends as having some information that perhaps we didn't. We don't want to be ostracized. We give value to the words and the attitudes espoused by our friends, and therefore, over time, when faced with a conflicting peer group, you may, depending on how tightly you hold those views, may cohere to your friends group's views, be that partisanship, ideologies, attitudes, and the like. Less likely to converge to a peer group's values. If you have values oppositional to that peer group, you may just go find another peer group. Other influential agents of socialization include clergy, teaching us what it means to be moral or what it means to be ethical in the world. It may be media personalities, it may be school teachers, and maybe even professors. It depends on what type of influence and at what stage of your political development it actually occurs. Now, political development is not something that reaches an end point in terms of socialization. We are constantly evolving, constantly learning throughout our lifetimes. It is the case, however, that once you get into your 20s to your 30s, you are largely resolved in your political identity. And this political identity tends to be durable throughout your lifetime. This is especially true for partisanship. Once you are solidified into that identity, it takes a significant external event or changes in your life circumstance in order to change that political identity. It can occur, it does occur, but it tends to become much more difficult as you progress in age and as your political identity becomes much more solidified here. Now, finally, let's talk about political knowledge because political knowledge is kind of the other side of the coin when we're talking about public opinion. In order to have attitudes, in order to have views on politics, you need to first have the requisite amount of knowledge about what that attitude is. If you are completely unaware about what socialized healthcare is, you're very unlikely to have a view on that topic. Now, the way in which we access, the way in which we gain political knowledge has, of course, changed over the past few decades. It used to be the case that most people, if they were going to be informed about politics at all, would get their information from newspapers, would get their information from the radio, eventually television. But with the rise of the internet and with the rise of social media, many people have begun to get their political information and their political knowledge exclusively from the internet or social media sources. We'll talk more about that in chapter 7 when we go over the media. I just wanted to highlight that over time, the source of political knowledge has fundamentally changed. However, when we gauge the American public, the degree of political knowledge, the amount of political knowledge is perhaps lower than what we would expect and certainly lower than what we would desire. Most people have very, very busy lives. Most people have jobs. Many people have children. They have a whole host of other things going on, and they're not going to pay attention to politics on a day by day basis. They may read the newspaper, sure, they may get a digital submission, but they may skip over to the sports section or the culture section. They may not seek out political information in the same way. And as a result, much of the political information that people gain comes exclusively around election time in the month or 2 months leading up to the election. And as a result, the degree of responsiveness of the government to public opinion is perhaps less than we would want. Ideally speaking, The government, being a representative government, should represent or otherwise reflect public opinion in what individual legislators or even the president does when in office. However, because many people do not pay particularly close attention to politics, and even if they do, the idea about public opinion is not really durable. It can change very rapidly. And as a result, legislators themselves are somewhat uncertain about what the public actually wants them to do. And when asked, that may not be a compelling source of information. And so, where we have the ideal form of democracy with legislators and representatives responding tightly to public opinion, it's a little bit more disconnected than that. What can we do about it? Well, unless everyone's going to read the newspaper and hold their legislators to account in a really meaningful way, not much. The best that we can do is try and pay close attention around election time and ensure accountability, if by no other means than through elections. So that's all I have for you today. Enjoy the rest of your week. And as always, feel free to reach out to me with any comments, questions, or concerns.